Before we begin today's story, I want to ask you something because I genuinely believe this is one of those questions that doesn't have an easy answer. If you discovered that someone you loved had hidden a life-changing secret from you for decades because they believed they were protecting you, would you eventually forgive them? Or would that betrayal be impossible to forget? I want you to think about that carefully and let me know your answer in the comments, because by the end of this story, you may find yourself looking at that question very differently. My name is Olga Hughes, and for 25 years, I carried a secret so heavy that there were mornings I would wake before the sun came up and simply lie there, staring at the ceiling, wondering how my heart was still capable of beating beneath the weight of everything I had buried. Time has a way of convincing people that old wounds eventually disappear, but that isn't true. Some wounds don't heal. They simply become quieter. They settle into the background of your life so completely that you almost convince yourself they've become part of who you are. That was my life for a quarter of a century. Every smile I gave, every holiday I celebrated, and every happy memory I created with my daughter stood beside a truth I prayed she would never discover. Most people believed they knew exactly who I was. They saw a hardworking woman who rarely complained, no matter how difficult life became. They saw a mother who never missed a school performance, parent-teacher meeting, birthday party, or graduation ceremony. They watched me leave for work before sunrise, return home after exhausting 12-hour shifts, and still find enough strength to cook dinner, help with homework, and make sure the house felt warm and welcoming. Friends often told me they admired how strong I was, and neighbors described me as the kind of person who would drop everything to help someone else. I always smiled politely when they said those things, because correcting them would have required explaining the part of myself I spent decades trying to hide. The truth is that people often mistake endurance for strength. They assume that because someone continues showing up every day, that person must be handling life well. What they don't see are the sleepless nights, the panic hidden behind ordinary conversations, or the constant fear that one terrible mistake from the past will eventually find its way back into the present. I became an expert at hiding those fears. I learned how to laugh while carrying guilt, how to celebrate milestones while remembering everything I wished I could undo, and how to comfort the person I loved most while knowing I was the very reason she carried a wound she never deserved.
That person was my daughter, Beverly Morris. Even now, saying her name brings back thousands of memories all at once. I remember the first time I held her in my arms, convinced that no mother had ever loved a child more deeply than I loved her. I remember scraped knees, bedtime stories, piano recitals, graduation ceremonies, and every ordinary moment in between that slowly becomes extraordinary when you realize how quickly children grow into adults. Everything I did, every sacrifice I made, revolved around giving Beverly a life better than the one I believed I could offer myself. By the time Beverly turned 25, she had become the kind of woman any parent would proudly brag about. She was intelligent, determined, compassionate, and remarkably independent. She built a successful career through hard work instead of shortcuts, treated people with kindness regardless of who they were, and possessed the quiet confidence that comes from earning every achievement on your own. Watching her grow into that woman became the greatest joy of my life. If someone had asked me then what I was most proud of, I wouldn't have mentioned my career, my home, or anything I own. I would have pointed to Beverly without hesitation, because raising her had always been the greatest accomplishment of my life. Yet over the weeks leading up to that unforgettable morning, something about her began to change in ways that only a mother could notice. At first, The differences were so subtle that I questioned whether I was imagining them. She laughed less often than she used to. Conversations that once flowed naturally became shorter, as though she was constantly distracted by thoughts she refused to share. During dinner, she often stared at her plate while absent-mindedly pushing food around with her fork, barely taking a bite before claiming she wasn't very hungry. Whenever I asked if work was becoming too stressful or if something was bothering her, she smiled politely and insisted everything was fine. Her words sounded convincing enough that anyone else would have believed them. But mothers eventually learn to hear what their children don't say. The morning everything changed began so normally that I sometimes replay it in my mind, searching for signs I somehow missed. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, filling the room with the warm glow that always made our little house feel peaceful. I was standing beside the counter, making coffee before work, enjoying one of those quiet moments that usually came before the rush of another ordinary day. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing suggested that within a few short hours, the life I had carefully built over 25 years would begin falling apart in ways I never imagined possible. A few moments later, Beverly walked into the kitchen wearing one of her favorite sweaters and quietly poured herself a cup of coffee. She looked beautiful, just as she always had, but there was something behind her eyes that immediately unsettled me. It wasn't simply sadness. It was the expression of someone carrying an invisible burden while trying desperately not to let anyone else notice. As she stood across from me, stirring sugar into her cup, I found myself studying her face longer than usual, hoping I would somehow understand what she wasn't telling me. The silence between us lingered just long enough that I finally broke it by asking the question every worried parent eventually asks. I gently asked whether she was all right, because she hadn't seemed like herself lately. Beverly looked up at me, and for the briefest moment, I caught a glimpse of the little girl who used to run into my arms whenever the world frightened her. Then, almost instantly, that familiar warmth disappeared behind a carefully constructed smile as she quietly assured me she was fine. Those two simple words should have comforted me, but instead they filled me with even greater unease, because experience had taught me that "I'm fine" is often the sentence people use when they're hurting the most. There was another reason my concern had grown so much during the previous week, one I hadn't shared with anyone, because admitting it aloud would have meant confronting a fear I wasn't ready to face. While putting away winter blankets a few days earlier, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten immediately. The old storage box, hidden behind several containers in the back of my bedroom closet, had been moved. To anyone else, it would have looked completely insignificant. To me, it was terrifying. That wasn't an ordinary storage box filled with forgotten belongings. It contained 25 years of memories I had deliberately hidden from the world. Inside were photographs, handwritten letters, birthday cards, legal documents, and pieces of a story I had convinced myself should remain buried forever. More importantly, it contained the truth about Beverly's father, Nicholson Jones, and the lie that had quietly shaped my daughter's entire life. As I watched Beverly finish her coffee that morning, a terrible possibility settled into my heart. I couldn't shake the feeling that she had found that box while I was at work. I wondered whether she had opened it, read the letters, and discovered everything I had spent decades trying to protect her from. Before I could stop myself, I gently asked one more time whether something was bothering her. Beverly looked directly into my eyes with an expression I had never seen before, and quietly asked whether I believed people could lie because they loved someone. The question hit me like ice water. My heart began pounding so loudly that I was certain she could hear it. Trying desperately to remain calm, I asked what she meant, but she simply shrugged, said she was only curious, picked up her keys, and walked toward the front door. I stood there watching her drive away, completely unaware that our conversation had just become the beginning of the worst day of my entire life. I stood in the kitchen for several minutes after Beverly drove away, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. Mothers have a habit of worrying over the smallest changes, and I desperately wanted to believe that was all this was. I told myself she was probably overwhelmed by work, dealing with a personal problem she wasn't yet ready to discuss, or simply having one of those weeks where life feels heavier than usual. People her age carried enormous pressure, and I knew better than anyone that not every burden needed to be shared immediately. Even so, the question she had asked me refused to leave my mind. Do you believe people can lie because they love someone? Those words echoed through my thoughts, as though they had been carved into the walls of the house. No matter how hard I tried to focus on ordinary things, my heart kept returning to that single conversation. I attempted to continue my morning as if nothing had happened. I washed the dishes, answered a few work emails, folded laundry that had been sitting in the basket since the previous evening, and even turned on the television simply to fill the silence. None of it helped. Every few minutes, I found myself glancing toward the hallway that led to Beverly's room, half expecting her to walk back through the front door with her usual smile and tell me I had been worrying for nothing. Instead, the house felt strangely empty, almost as though it already knew something I didn't. It is difficult to explain, but anyone who has ever loved someone deeply understands that there are moments when your heart begins grieving long before your mind understands why. Eventually, I decided to leave the house and run a few errands. I convinced myself that getting out for a while would clear my thoughts and stop me from imagining disasters that didn't exist. The refrigerator needed groceries, I was almost out of coffee, and there were several household items I had been meaning to replace for days. Ordinary routines have a way of making life feel stable, and I hoped a simple shopping trip would return me to that sense of normalcy. Before leaving, I considered calling Beverly one more time just to check on her, but I stopped myself. I didn't want to become the overbearing mother who hovered every time her adult daughter seemed distracted. I believed that if she truly needed me, she would reach out when she was ready. The drive to the grocery store passed in complete silence because I couldn't even bring myself to turn on the radio. Every familiar song suddenly felt out of place against the growing anxiety inside me. At nearly every red light, I reached for my phone, thinking about sending Beverly a simple message, asking whether she wanted me to bring anything home. Each time, I changed my mind and placed the phone back on the passenger seat. I kept reminding myself that she deserved space and independence. Looking back now, I often wonder how differently that day might have unfolded if I had ignored my pride and called her anyway. Perhaps nothing would have changed. Perhaps everything would have. I had just pulled into the grocery store parking lot when my phone vibrated beside me. The sound instantly caught my attention because I had been hoping all morning that Beverly would finally contact me. A smile crossed my face before I even looked at the screen, relieved that she had decided to reach out first. For one brief, beautiful moment, I believed the tension between us had been nothing more than my imagination. I picked up the phone expecting to see an ordinary message, asking me to pick up milk or reminding me about dinner later that evening. Instead, I found myself staring at words that shattered every illusion I had been clinging to. The message was painfully short. It simply read, "Goodbye, Mom. Don't look for me. I know everything." At first, my mind refused to process what I was reading. I blinked several times, convinced there had to be another explanation. Perhaps she meant someone else's secret? Perhaps she was joking, although Beverly had never joked about anything remotely serious. Then, the meaning crashed into me all at once. She had found the box. She had read the letters. She knew about Nicholson. She knew that everything she believed about her father had been built upon a lie I allowed to exist. The phone nearly slipped from my hands as my entire body went cold. For several long seconds, I couldn't move. Cars entered and exited the parking lot around me, while shoppers walked past carrying grocery bags, laughing with their children, or talking casually on their phones. Life continued exactly as it had only moments earlier, but mine had stopped completely. I felt trapped inside my own body, unable to breathe properly as panic spread through me faster than I thought possible. I immediately pressed Beverly's contact and held the phone to my ear, praying she would answer before my imagination created even worse possibilities than the ones already consuming me. The call rang until it reached voicemail. I ended it and dialed again without hesitation. Once more, there was no answer. I called a third time, and this time the call went directly to voicemail before it had a chance to ring. My hands began trembling so violently that I could barely keep hold of the phone. I whispered Beverly's name over and over again as though somehow she could hear me through the silence. Tears blurred my vision, but I refused to let myself break down completely because I knew I couldn't waste another second sitting in that parking lot. Every instinct inside me screamed that I needed to get home immediately. I started the car so quickly that I barely remembered fastening my seatbelt before pulling out of the parking space. The drive home became one long blur of fear, guilt, and memories colliding inside my mind. I remembered Beverly taking her first unsteady steps across our living room floor while reaching toward me with both tiny hands. I remembered walking her to elementary school on her very first day, reassuring her that I would be waiting outside when classes ended. I remembered the evening she came home crying after a father-daughter school dance because she couldn't understand why every other child seemed to have a father except her. She had climbed into my lap with tears streaming down her face and asked me whether her father had ever loved her at all. I held her as tightly as I could and told her that his leaving had nothing to do with her. At the time, I believed I was protecting her from pain. Now I realized I had been protecting a lie. By the time I reached our street, I was already preparing myself for the possibility that Beverly had simply packed a bag and gone to stay with a friend until she could calm down. I clung desperately to that hope because the alternative was too terrifying to imagine. The moment I pulled into the driveway, however, something felt wrong. The front door stood slightly open, swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. Beverly never left the house like that. She had always been careful, always checking that every window and every lock were secure before leaving. My heart pounded as I rushed from the car and pushed the door fully open while calling her name as loudly as I could. The silence that greeted me inside the house was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't peaceful silence. It was the kind that makes every room feel unfamiliar, as though the walls themselves are holding their breath. I searched the living room, the kitchen, and every corner of the downstairs before racing up the stairs two at a time. When I reached Beverly's bedroom, I stopped so suddenly that I nearly lost my balance. The room looked as though someone had carefully erased pieces of her life. Several drawers stood open, favorite clothes were missing from the closet, and the suitcase she usually kept beneath her bed was gone. Then my eyes settled on a large trash bag resting quietly in the center of the bed. I walked toward it with trembling hands, already knowing that whatever waited inside would change my life forever. For several long moments, I simply stood in the doorway of Beverly's bedroom, unable to make myself walk any farther. The room still smelled faintly of the lavender candle she loved to burn in the evenings while reading, and everything that remained seemed painfully familiar. Her bookshelf stood exactly as she had left it. Her favorite sweater was draped over the back of a chair, and a framed photograph of us from a family vacation smiled back at me from her dresser. Yet, despite all those familiar comforts, something inside the room had changed forever. It no longer felt like the bedroom of my daughter. It felt like the place where the life we had built together had quietly fallen apart while I wasn't paying attention. My eyes remained fixed on the large trash bag resting on the bed. Every instinct told me not to open it, because I already knew nothing inside could possibly make this day any easier. Still, I forced myself forward until I was standing beside the bed with trembling hands. The plastic crinkled softly as I pulled it open, revealing pieces of our shared life that Beverly had carefully gathered together before leaving. Sitting on top were framed photographs of birthdays, vacations, graduations, and Christmas mornings. Underneath them were Mother's Day cards she had made as a little girl, each one decorated with crooked hearts, colorful flowers, and handwriting that became neater as she grew older. There were drawings from elementary school, little handmade gifts she once proudly presented to me, and keepsakes I thought she treasured as much as I did. Seeing them all discarded together felt as though she hadn't simply left the house. She had tried to leave behind every memory that connected her to me. I picked up one of the photographs with shaking fingers. It showed Beverly at 6 years old, sitting on my shoulders during a county fair, both of us smiling so broadly that our happiness seemed to leap straight from the picture. I remembered that day perfectly. She had begged me to ride the Ferris wheel 3 times, insisted on eating far too much cotton candy, and fallen asleep against my shoulder before we even reached home. Looking at that picture now, I couldn't stop wondering whether every happy memory we shared had suddenly become painful for her. I wondered if she now questioned every bedtime story, every comforting hug, and every promise I had ever made. The thought that my own daughter might no longer know which parts of her childhood had been real broke something deep inside me. As I continued sorting through the contents of the bag, my attention shifted toward a single cream-colored envelope lying beneath the photographs. My breath caught the moment I recognized my own daughter's handwriting across the front. In neat, careful letters, she had written, "For the mother I thought I knew." I stared at those words for what felt like an eternity before finally lowering myself onto the edge of her bed. Tears were already falling long before I opened the envelope, because deep down, I knew exactly why she had written it. The secret I had protected for 25 years had finally reached the person I was trying hardest to shield from it. And now there was nothing left standing between us, except the truth. I unfolded the letter as carefully as though it might somehow fall apart in my hands. Beverly's handwriting was steady, but every sentence carried a pain so profound that I could almost hear her voice speaking each word aloud. She wrote that the greatest hurt wasn't discovering that her father had loved her after all. The greatest hurt was realizing that I had known the truth while watching her spend years believing she had been abandoned. She reminded me of every birthday when she wondered why Nicholson never called, every Father's Day she pretended not to care, and every childhood question I answered with half-truths because I believed they were kinder than the reality. Reading those words felt like standing in front of a mirror that reflected every mistake I had ever made as a mother. The letter continued by describing the moment she found the storage box hidden inside my closet. She explained that she hadn't been searching for secrets at all. She had simply been looking for extra blankets when she accidentally knocked the box onto the floor. The lid opened, scattering photographs, letters, and documents around her feet. At first, she intended to place everything back exactly as she found it. Then she noticed Nicholson's name written across one of the envelopes. Curiosity turned into confusion. Confusion became disbelief. And before long, she had spent hours sitting on my bedroom floor reading every letter her father had written over the years. With every page, another piece of the life she believed she understood disappeared forever. Beverly wrote that the birthday cards hurt her more than anything else. Year after year, Nicholson had written to her, even though he never knew whether she would read a single word. He celebrated milestones he had only imagined, offered advice for problems he hoped she would someday overcome, and ended every card by telling her how deeply he loved her. She admitted that she cried while reading them because they sounded nothing like the man she had spent her entire childhood picturing. Instead of the uncaring father she believed had walked away without looking back, she discovered someone who seemed desperate to remain part of her life, despite the impossible distance between them. Then came the sentence that completely shattered me. She wrote that I had watched her cry for years while allowing her to hate a man who had never stopped loving her. By the time I reached the final page, my tears had soaked through the paper. I could barely see the words anymore because my vision had become blurred with grief and regret. For years, I convinced myself that hiding the truth would protect Beverly from even greater pain. I believed I was preserving whatever stability remained after Nicholson disappeared from our lives. Looking back, I finally understood the terrible irony of my choices. In trying to spare her heartbreak, I had unknowingly created a different kind of heartbreak, one that lasted her entire childhood and followed her into adulthood. The lies I told were never cruel in intention, but their consequences had become devastating all the same. I lowered the letter into my lap and buried my face in my hands as memories I had spent decades trying to suppress came rushing back all at once. This story had never truly begun with Beverly. Long before she was born, long before our family fell apart, there had been another chapter I rarely allowed myself to revisit. It was a chapter filled with love, trust, impossible decisions, and mistakes that could never be undone. At the center of that forgotten beginning stood Nicholson Jones, the man Beverly believed had abandoned her, and Dolores Grant, the woman I once trusted so completely that I considered her more like a sister than a friend. Thinking about Dolores after all these years filled me with a mixture of anger, sorrow, and disbelief, because no matter how many times I replayed the past, I still struggled to understand how someone I loved so deeply could betray me so completely. As the afternoon sunlight slowly faded across Beverly's empty bedroom, I realized there was no longer any point in hiding from the past. The letter lying in my hands had made one thing painfully clear. If I wanted any chance of finding my daughter and repairing what remained of our relationship, I would first have to confront the woman whose choices had set all of this in motion. Beverly believed she had uncovered the biggest secret of our family's history, but she had only discovered the beginning. She knew about the letters, the birthday cards, and the years of silence. What she didn't know was that Dolores Grant had been carrying another secret all along, one far darker than anything hidden inside that storage box. And somewhere deep inside my heart, I knew that if I was ever going to bring my daughter home, I would have to face that truth, before it destroyed what little remained of our family. I don't know how long I remained sitting on Beverly's bed after finishing her letter. Time seemed to lose all meaning as I stared at the pages resting in my lap, unable to convince myself that any of this was real. Every sentence she had written replayed inside my head until I could practically recite the letter from memory. There was no anger left in me by then, only overwhelming sorrow. The little girl I had spent my entire life protecting now believed I had stolen something from her that could never be returned. As painful as it was to admit, she wasn't entirely wrong. I had convinced myself for years that I was preserving her innocence. But somewhere along the way, protection had quietly become deception. And deception had grown into a burden far too heavy for either of us to carry.
Eventually, I folded the letter as carefully as I could and slid it back inside its envelope. I carried the photographs, birthday cards, and childhood keepsakes downstairs, one item at a time, placing them gently on the living room coffee table. Looking at them spread across the room felt like watching 25 years of motherhood laid out before me. Every smiling picture now carried a question I could no longer avoid. How many of those happy moments had been built upon a foundation that was never completely honest? Beverly's laughter had always been real. My love for her had always been real. But the story I gave her about her father had never been the complete truth. And now every memory felt stained by that omission. As evening settled over the house, I found myself staring toward the hallway that led to my bedroom. Behind the closet door sat the storage box that had remained hidden for so many years. It no longer made sense to keep pretending it didn't exist. The box had already done what I feared most. It had found its way into Beverly's hands, and with it came questions I should have answered years ago. I slowly walked upstairs, opened the closet, and carefully lifted the box down from the highest shelf. It felt strangely lighter than I remembered, perhaps because the greatest weight it carried had never been the papers inside. It had always been the guilt attached to them. I placed the box on my bed and slowly opened the lid. Inside, everything remained exactly where I had left it, except for the envelopes Beverly had already read. Nicholson's handwriting filled page after page, each letter written with remarkable consistency, despite the years that separated them. There were birthday cards addressed to Beverly on her 5th birthday, her 10th, her 16th, and every birthday in between. There were photographs of Nicholson standing beside places he hoped one day to show his daughter. And there were countless pages describing the milestones he imagined she might be reaching. Every document reminded me that I had once believed hiding these things was an act of love. Looking at them now, I could only see the pain they had eventually caused. As I carefully returned everything to the box, my attention drifted toward a much older photograph tucked beneath several folders. It showed 3 smiling faces, standing shoulder to shoulder many years before Beverly was born. One was mine. Beside me stood Nicholson Jones, his arm resting comfortably around my shoulders as we laughed at something beyond the camera. Standing on my other side was Dolores Grant, smiling just as brightly as the two of us. Looking at that photograph felt almost surreal, because it captured a time when none of us imagined our lives would unravel the way they eventually did. We weren't enemies. We weren't strangers. We were inseparable friends who believed nothing could ever come between us. Dolores had entered my life years before I met Nicholson, and our friendship developed so naturally that it often felt as though we had known each other forever. She celebrated every promotion I earned, encouraged me through difficult seasons,
and remained beside me during moments when I questioned whether I was strong enough to keep moving forward. She became the sister life had never given me. We shared holidays together, helped each other through heartbreak, and spoke so often that a single day without hearing her voice felt unusual. When I introduced her to Nicholson, I never once imagined that the three of us would become connected by a story that would eventually destroy everything we cared about. Nicholson fit into our lives almost effortlessly. He possessed the kind of quiet confidence that made people feel comfortable around him within minutes of meeting him. He wasn't loud or boastful, nor did he feel the need to be the center of attention whenever we gathered with friends. Instead, he listened more than he spoke, laughed easily, and treated everyone around him with genuine respect. The man Beverly had imagined for most of her life bore almost no resemblance to the man I had once fallen in love with. That painful contradiction was precisely why I spent so many years hiding the truth. Every time she cried because she believed her father had abandoned her, I reminded myself that exposing the past would only make things more complicated. I convinced myself that some truths hurt more than silence. Looking back now, I realized silence had become its own form of cruelty.
There were countless nights over the years when I considered telling Beverly everything. I would rehearse the conversation while driving home from work or lying awake in bed after everyone else had fallen asleep. I imagined sitting across from her at the kitchen table, explaining every decision I made and every mistake I wished I could erase. But each time I came close, fear stopped me. I feared she would hate me. I feared she would spend the rest of her life chasing answers that could never truly heal her. Most of all, I feared reopening wounds I had spent decades trying to close. So I remained silent, convincing myself there would always be another opportunity. Now that opportunity had disappeared, along with my daughter.
As darkness settled outside the windows, I carried the storage box back downstairs and placed it beside the photographs Beverly had left behind. The house had become painfully quiet, but inside my mind, memories refused to rest. Every path I followed eventually led back to the same person. No matter how desperately I searched for another explanation, every important decision, every misunderstanding, and every heartbreaking consequence eventually circled back to Dolores Grant. Beverly believed discovering Nicholson's letters explained everything, but those letters were only one piece of a much larger story. There were questions she still couldn't answer because she had never been given the chance to see what happened before she was born. I sat quietly on the sofa as the evening grew darker, knowing there was no escaping the past any longer. For 25 years, I had tried to protect everyone by keeping certain truths buried. But secrets have a way of demanding daylight, whether we are ready or not. Beverly now understood that her father had written to her all those years. What she didn't know was why those letters never reached her in the first place. She also didn't know that the woman she had always known as my closest friend had been standing at the center of everything from the very beginning. Dolores Grant wasn't simply part of our family's history. She was the reason that history had unfolded the way it did. And somewhere beneath all the lies, misunderstandings, and years of silence, she was still hiding one final secret that even Beverly had not yet uncovered.
Sleep never came that night. I remained on the living room sofa with Beverly's letter resting in my hands, reading it over and over until I could no longer tell whether I was seeing the words on the page or remembering them from my own guilt. Every sentence forced me to relive another chapter of my daughter's childhood, another moment when she searched my face for answers I refused to give.
I had spent 25 years convincing myself that I was protecting her from pain. But as dawn slowly crept through the windows, I finally accepted something I should have understood long ago. Secrets do not disappear simply because we bury them. They grow quietly beneath the surface, until one day, they become impossible to contain.
As the first rays of sunlight filled the room, I looked around at the house that Beverly had always called home. Every corner carried a memory of her. I could still picture her running through the hallway on Christmas mornings before I had even climbed out of bed. I remembered the afternoons when she spread school books across the dining table while asking me questions about history assignments neither of us truly understood. I remembered movie nights on the sofa, birthday celebrations with homemade cakes, and evenings when she fell asleep with her head resting against my shoulder because she insisted she wasn't too old for hugs. Those memories were real. The love between us had always been real. That was what hurt the most. A relationship built on genuine love had still been damaged by a truth left unspoken.
People often believe betrayal only comes from hatred or cruelty, but life has taught me something far more complicated. Sometimes people betray those they love while believing they are doing the right thing. Sometimes fear disguises itself as protection until you can no longer tell the difference between the two. Looking back, I understood that every decision I made had been guided by fear. I feared losing Beverly's trust. I feared reopening old wounds. I feared exposing parts of the past that I desperately wanted to leave behind. Ironically, every attempt to avoid those fears eventually led me directly to them. By trying to control the truth, I had only delayed the pain until it became far greater than it ever needed to be.
Even after everything that had happened, I couldn't bring myself to blame Beverly for walking away. If our positions had been reversed, I honestly didn't know whether I would have reacted any differently. She had discovered that the story she'd believed her entire life wasn't complete. She had found years of letters, birthday cards, and evidence that raised more questions than answers. She had every reason to feel confused, hurt, and angry. As much as I wanted her to come home immediately, another part of me hoped she was somewhere safe, taking the time she needed to process everything before making another decision. No mother wants her child to suffer, even when that suffering is directed toward her. My thoughts eventually returned to Nicholson Jones. For years, I had avoided saying his name aloud unless someone forced the conversation. Even then, I kept my answers painfully short, hoping the subject would disappear as quickly as it appeared. Now, there was no escaping him anymore. Beverly had read his words with her own eyes. She knew those letters existed. She knew he had written to her throughout the years. But letters alone could never explain an entire lifetime. They answered some questions while creating dozens more, and I understood why my daughter had been overwhelmed. If I had uncovered the same box without knowing any of the history behind it, I probably would have reacted exactly as she had. Then there was Dolores Grant. Just thinking about her name filled me with emotions I had spent years trying to bury. We had once shared dreams, laughter, celebrations, and countless ordinary moments that seemed unbreakable at the time. I trusted her with parts of my life I had never shared with anyone else, believing loyalty like ours would last forever. Looking back, I often wondered whether there had been signs I ignored or conversations I misunderstood, because I never imagined someone so close to me could play such an important role in changing the course of my family's future. Trust has a strange way of blinding us. The people capable of hurting us the most are often the very people we never think to question. I slowly gathered Beverly's photographs and returned them to the trash bag, not because I wanted to hide them again,
but because I couldn't bear seeing them scattered across the room any longer. Each picture reminded me of a different version of my daughter, from the fearless little girl who believed I could fix every problem, to the thoughtful young woman who had quietly carried questions she never voiced. I prayed those photographs still meant something to her, despite everything that had happened. I prayed that one day she would look at them again and remember that despite my mistakes, every hug, every bedtime story, every birthday celebration, and every sacrifice had come from a place of genuine love. Before placing the storage box back where it belonged, I rested my hand on the lid for several seconds. That small box had silently followed me through nearly a quarter of a century. It had survived moves, new jobs, birthdays, graduations, and every milestone Beverly reached. I always believed I was preserving history by keeping it hidden, but history has a way of demanding to be acknowledged. The past doesn't simply disappear because we refuse to speak about it. Eventually, it finds its own voice. Mine had arrived through a single text message and a letter written by the daughter I feared I had lost forever.
I don't know where Beverly was at that moment. I didn't know whether she was angry enough to never answer another phone call or whether she was somewhere crying just as hard as I had cried through the night. What I did know was that the story wasn't over. Too many questions remained unanswered. Too many conversations had never taken place, and too much of our family's history remained hidden beneath years of silence. The truth had finally begun to surface, but only a small part of it had been revealed. The rest was still waiting, and whether it healed us or broke us completely would depend on what happened next. What Beverly didn't know yet was exactly what I had realized while sitting alone with those letters. The story she believed had finally been uncovered was only the beginning. This story had never started with her discovery of the storage box, and it certainly wasn't ending there. It began years earlier with me, Nicholson Jones, and Dolores Grant. Beverly now knew enough to understand that her father had not been the man she believed him to be, but she still didn't know why everything unfolded the way it did. She didn't know that Dolores had been carrying another secret all these years, one even greater than the letter she had already found. And somewhere inside that hidden truth lay the answer to a question that had haunted our family for 25 years. That was where my story had to pause, because before any healing could begin, the rest of the truth would finally have to be told. If you've stayed with me until the end of this first part, thank you from the bottom of my heart for taking this emotional journey with me. Stories like these remind us that families are rarely as simple as they appear from the outside, and that love, regret, and difficult choices often become tangled together in ways that can change lives forever. I'd really love to hear what you think. If you were Beverly and discovered those hidden letters after believing something completely different for 25 years, what would you have done? Would you have left immediately like she did? Or would you have stayed to hear your mother's side first? Share your thoughts in the comments because I read them all, and your perspectives always make these stories even more meaningful. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who enjoys powerful stories about family, betrayal, forgiveness, and emotional twists. Your support helps echoes of trust and betrayals continue bringing you stories that stay with you long after the video ends. And don't forget, this is only part 1. We'll continue the story in part 2, picking up exactly where we left off. Until then, thank you for watching, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next episode.